Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. I'm glad you're here. Tonight's story comes from a man named Declan Murdoch. He's 54 years old from County Roscommon in the west of Ireland. He spent 24 years in the Irish Army, not a combat soldier, he'll tell you that straight away. A logistics man. The kind of person who made sure everything got where it needed to go on time, accounted for, precise, methodical. A man who, by his own description, checked everything twice. That last part matters, because what happened to Declan in Ho Chi Minh City didn't happen to a naive man or a careless one. It happened to someone who was paying attention, or at least believed he was. And there's a difference between those two things that this story is going to make very clear. The massage industry in Ho Chi Minh City is enormous. The vast majority of it is entirely legitimate. Hard-working practitioners doing an honest job in a city that never really stops moving. But there are corridors within it where other things happen. Not always what you'd expect. Sometimes more patient. Sometimes more considered. Sometimes designed specifically for men who think they're too smart to be fooled. Declan's story is not a total disaster. He got out. He kept more than he lost. But he paid for what he learned, and he wanted to tell it anyway. And I think you'll understand why by the end. This one is going to stay with you. Here's his story, in his own words. The place you need to understand first is the Curragh. It's a plain in County Kildare. Flat, wide, grass as far as you can see. And in winter, a wind that comes from nowhere and goes directly through you. The Irish Army has its main base there. I spent more of my adult life on that plain than I spent anywhere else, including my own house. And I want you to hold that thought because it matters later. I wasn't a soldier in the way people mean when they say soldier. No rifle, no heroics. I was logistics, transport corps. My job was making sure things arrived, fuel, equipment, personnel, supplies, in the right place at the right time in the right condition. 24 years of that. Lebanon under UNIFIL, a stint in Chad that I don't talk about much. Years of domestic postings at the Curragh and Finner Camp and Collins Barracks in Cork. The work suited me. There's a satisfaction to a well-run supply chain that I'd struggle to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. The clean geometry of it, everything accounted for, nothing missing, no surprises. I was good at it. It was the thing I was most good at, if I'm being straight with you. It is not, I should say, a skill set that makes you interesting at dinner parties. My wife Chauvin used to say I talked about inventory management the way other men talked about football. She wasn't wrong. Chauvin. Right, we need to get to Chauvin. 22 years married. 2 kids. Cormac, who was 19 when all this happened, and Aoif, who was 17. We had a semi-detached house in Athlone, near the Shannon, which Chauvin had done up nicely over the years while I was away being useful somewhere else. I retired at 51 with a pension and a plan, and the reasonable expectation that the second half of my life would resemble the first one, just with more time in it. She told me on a Tuesday, over dinner. I remember it was a Tuesday because I'd cooked. Pasta, nothing impressive. And she waited until I'd sat down, which I thought was considerate of her in retrospect. She'd been unhappy for years, apparently. She'd met someone at work. Not a dramatic affair, nothing sordid, just she'd found a person who was present in the way I hadn't managed to be. I asked her if she was sure. She said yes. I slept on the couch for 2 weeks, which is less comfortable than the Army ever was. And then I found a 2-bedroom rental in Roscommon town. And I moved into it with my clothes and my laptop and a coffee maker I'd bought at a Lidl on the way. She was grand about it. I mean, she wasn't, obviously. But she was very organized about it. The house went to her. Half my savings went, and a bit more than half, actually, but I wasn't in the mood to argue, and I don't think arguing would have changed the arithmetic much. The pension stayed because it was mine and couldn't be touched. Cormac and a wife stayed with their mother, which nobody said out loud, but which was clearly what was happening. Cormac was nearly a man anyway and barely noticed me at the best of times. Wife messaged on Sundays when she remembered. I'm not looking for sympathy on any of this. I want to be clear about that. I'm just telling you what was true. The flat in Roscommon was fine. 2 bedrooms I didn't need, a kitchen, a window that looked out onto a car park. I'd been in worse quarters in Chad by some margin. But the Army had always given me a shape to my days. A schedule, a purpose, a sequence of tasks that needed doing and that I was the person responsible for doing them. Retired and divorced at 51 in a 2-bedroom rental? I had none of that. I'm not great at doing nothing, The Army doesn't really prepare you for that. 8 months I was in that flat before anything shifted. Bad sleep, mostly. Too much television. Long walks along the Shannon that I didn't particularly enjoy but felt I should take. I tried a few things. A local GAA supporters club that I had no real interest in. An evening class in woodworking that I attended twice before the instructor started playing music I found intolerable. A couple of nights out with men I'd served with who were still local, which ended early because everyone had somewhere to be by 10 o'clock and I didn't. Then Siran Connolly sent me a photo. Siran was from Tipperary. We'd served together in Lebanon. He was Transport Corps as well, different regiment. But you get to know people on those postings. Good man, dry as the Sahara. He'd gone to Da Nang about 18 months after he retired, which I'd heard about third hand and not thought much of. Then, one night in November, 11:30, I'm sitting in the Roscommon flat in the dark watching some program I couldn't tell you the name of, and my phone goes. It was a photo of the Han River at sunset, orange and pink across the water, a bridge lit up in the background, and underneath it, Kieran had written, "Come out. You'll either fix yourself or you won't, but at least you'll be warm." I thought, Vietnam. Right. And then I thought about it for 3 more weeks, at 11:30 on another wet night, and booked the flights anyway. I didn't research it properly. I watched a handful of YouTube videos which were mostly men in their 40s, telling me how cheap everything was. And I booked a 3-week trip to Ho Chi Minh City because flights were cheaper than Hanoi, and because I needed, and this is the honest version, I needed to be somewhere that didn't have Chauvin's handwriting on things. The divorce papers were filed. The flat in Roscommon had her handwriting on the lease because she'd found it for me. I needed somewhere with no handwriting on anything. I told myself I was just having a look. That was the phrase I used in my head when I was justifying the decision to myself. Just having a look. I landed at Tan Son Nhat at 2 in the morning, and the heat came through the terminal doors like something physical, like a wall that hadn't been there a moment before. 28 degrees at 2 in the morning in November. I stood on the pavement outside arrivals with my rucksack, and a taxi driver was immediately in my face with a price I later learned was twice what it should have been. And the traffic on the airport road was already moving with that particular density you only understand once you've seen it. Motorbikes weaving between taxis and minibuses and trucks. Everyone going somewhere urgently. Horns as communication rather than protest. And something in my chest, which had been clenched since a Tuesday dinner in Athlone, unclenched slightly. Not much, but enough to notice. Nobody here knew my name. Nobody here knew I'd been on the couch for 2 weeks. Nobody here cared whether I was grand or not. I was just another middle-aged man with a rucksack standing on a pavement at 2 in the morning. And in that moment, I cannot fully explain to you why, that was exactly what I needed to be. The taxi driver dropped me at a guest house on a street running parallel to Pham Ngu Lao, which I could not pronounce then and can only roughly manage now. 180,000 dong a night, about €6.50, for a room with a bed, a window unit that worked intermittently, and a bathroom the size of a wardrobe. I'd stayed in worse on exercises in the Kura. I dropped my rucksack, lay on the bed fully dressed, and was asleep before I'd made any decision to be. I woke up at 6:30 because that's when I always wake up. Old habit. The street outside was already moving. A woman on a Honda Wave with a tower of baguettes strapped to the back, a man hosing down the pavement in front of his shop, 2 men drinking coffee on plastic stools the size of footrests, talking in the unhurried way of people with nowhere particular to be at 6:30 in the morning. The smell coming up from the street was exhaust and something frying, and underneath it, a sweetness I couldn't identify. Incense, I found out later, from a small altar just inside the guest house door. 3 pieces of fruit and a stick of incense and a laminated photograph of someone's grandmother. The owner's wife refreshed it every morning. I walked past it every day for 3 weeks, and I never stopped finding it quietly remarkable. I am a man who needs a routine, so I built one inside the first 2 days. Coffee at 7, not the Highlands coffee on the main road that catered to the office workers, but a plastic stool place in the alley beside the guest house where a woman made cha fei sua ja by pouring condensed milk into a glass over ice and then setting a small metal filter on top to drip through. Slowly, you couldn't rush it. I sat there every morning and didn't rush it. And this was, I think, the most useful thing Vietnam did for me in those first weeks. Walk by 8. Nap at noon because the heat, 34 degrees by midday, made any ambition beyond sitting in the shade genuinely difficult. Out again by 4 when it eased slightly. Crossing the road took me 3 days to learn. The thing about Ho Chi Minh City traffic is that it doesn't stop. It never stops. There are no gaps you're waiting for. You just step off the curb and move at a steady, predictable pace, and the motorbikes flow around you like water around a stone. Stop halfway across and you've destroyed the logic of it. Stop and they can't predict where you'll be. I thought about that a lot later. More than I should have, probably, but there it is. I encountered the expat community quickly because it's impossible not to. They congregate in a belt around Bui Vien and the streets nearby, the English teachers in their 50s who'd come for a year and stayed for a decade, the Australian retirees at the corner bar who were on their third tiger by 3 in the afternoon. The men I came to think of privately as the Forum Warriors, the ones who'd been here 15 years and had a fully formed opinion on every topic from visa regulations to the best place to get a fry-up in District 2. They were mostly harmless. Some of them were kind. But I wasn't there to find community, and I kept a distance from it that some of them found rude and I found necessary. On day 3, I went to the War Remnants Museum. I want to say something about this carefully because it's not the point of this story, but it's not nothing either. I'm a soldier. Was a soldier. I spent 24 years moving the material of military operations from one place to another, and standing in a room looking at photographs of what those operations do to the people on the receiving end of them it sits in you in a particular way. I don't have a political point to make. I just came out of there quieter than I went in, and I walked the long way back to the guest house, and I thought about Chad in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in a while. Days 3 to 5, I ranged further. I took a grab out to Cu Chi, 40 minutes through traffic that gradually thinned as the city loosened into something approaching outskirts, and spent 2 hours underground in tunnels so narrow I had to turn sideways, trying to imagine what it meant to live in them for years. The guide was a small man in his 60s who told the whole story with a bone-dry humor that I appreciated enormously. I ate com tam at a place near the guest house that had 6 items on the menu and a television showing a Vietnamese soap opera and where nobody tried to show me an English version of anything. But I was spending money in a way I hadn't in 2 years. Freely, without calculation. And it felt strange and good simultaneously, like a muscle being used after a long rest. Day 6 was the back. I'd been on my feet for 4 hours in the heat, which a man of 54 with an L4 to L5 disc problem, acquired somewhere between the Curragh and Chad, has no business doing without consequence. The lower back announced itself around 2 in the afternoon in that flat, insistent way it had. Not agony, just the particular language of a thing that had been ignored for long enough. I turned off Bui Vien down a side street looking for shade and somewhere to sit, and I saw the sign. It was a clean-looking place. That was the first thing I noticed. A proper sign, not a hand-painted one. Matching uniforms on the staff. Pale green, logo on the chest, and a laminated menu in English and Vietnamese on a stand near the door. Not one of the neon-lit operations a few streets over where the women sit on stools outside, calling after anyone who walks past. This looked like somewhere you could go for your back and come out having dealt with your back. I went in. The receptionist gave me a menu and I stood there for probably 45 seconds failing to decide, and she eventually pointed at something and said, in excellent English, traditional, for back pain. 90 minutes. I said that'd do. She showed me to a room. Lynn was already in the room, rolling up her sleeves. She was 31, though I didn't know her age then. Small, precise in her movements in the way of someone who is very good at a physical job and knows it. She said nothing for the first 20 minutes, just worked, and systematically on exactly the parts that needed it, which told me she'd assess the situation immediately and competently, which I always respect in a person. Then, quietly, she asked whether the pressure was okay. I said it was grand. She said, "What does grand mean?" I said it means fine. It means good. It's an Irish thing. She said she thought Irish people said top of the morning. I said only in films. She laughed. It wasn't a performed laugh. It was the laugh of someone who has been told something they find genuinely funny. She had learned her English, she told me, from American crime procedurals, specifically The Wire. She could, she said, explain in some detail how to launder money through a vacant lot but had limited vocabulary for describing weather. I'd seen The Wire. Yeah, I told her Omar was the greatest television character ever written, And she said she preferred bunk. And this was such an unexpected and specific opinion that I laughed out loud on the table, which is not something I'd done in a while. Afterward, I was paying at the reception desk and I asked where a decent coffee place nearby was, meaning I'd go there alone. And Lynn, who was finishing her shift, jacket already on, mentioned the place next door and gestured in that direction. I said, did she want one? She thought for a second and said, sure. We sat on plastic stools at a folding table on the pavement. She had a café sua ja. I had the same. The coffee dripped through its filter with the same unhurried patience as every other coffee in this city, and we talked for 40 minutes while it did. She asked about my back, genuinely, as if tracking a patient's progress. I asked about the job, she asked about Ireland, and I told her about Roscommon. And she said she'd heard of Dublin. And I said everybody had, and she asked what was in Roscommon. And I said not much, and that's why I was here. She didn't ask me anything about my personal life. She didn't volunteer anything about hers beyond the logistics of the work schedule. It was just two people talking on a warm evening, the motorbikes going past and the smell of grilling meat from somewhere behind us, and the ice melting slowly in my glass. That's all it was. When we stood up to go, she took out her phone and said, "Here, in case you need another appointment," and added me on Zalo. Then she said her shift started early tomorrow and she should go. And she went. I walked back to the guest house. I had her Zalo contact on my phone. I told myself this meant nothing in particular, which I believed more or less. She was 31. I was 54. I wasn't an idiot. I knew what I was and what I wasn't, and what I was not was the sort of man a 31-year-old woman in Ho Chi Minh City was interested in for reasons unconnected to my pension. I told myself I was just having a look. She messaged first. I want to be precise about that because it matters to what I thought it meant. The morning after the coffee, I was at my usual stool, the café suaja dripping away, not thinking about anything in particular, and the Zalo notification came through. A photo of a bowl of bun bo huo, the spicy beef noodle soup, with a short message. Staff meal before shift? She always had this on Tuesdays. That was all. No question attached to it. No invitation to respond. Just a person sharing a thing that was happening in their day. I sat with my phone for a moment. Then I put it face down on the table and finished my coffee. I want to be clear about something because I can hear what you're thinking. I wasn't falling for her like a young fella. I wasn't swept up in anything. I was watching her. I was assessing. I was doing, in my head, the same kind of evaluation I'd spent 24 years doing with supply chains and personnel. Is this reliable? Is this what it says it is? What are the failure modes? I was a professional, that's what I told myself. And the assessment at that stage returned nothing concerning. A woman sending a photo of her lunch is not a threat indicator. It's just a woman sending a photo of her lunch. I replied, "Looks better than what I'm having." She sent back a single laughing emoji, and that was the entire exchange. This went on for several days. The rhythm of it was loose, unforced. When one of us had something to say, we said it, and when we didn't, we didn't. She asked about the army at some point in the way people ask when they're actually curious rather than just filling space. And I found myself telling her things I hadn't talked about in years. Not the heavy stuff. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I unburdened my soul to a woman I'd known for a week. But the texture of the work, the particular puzzle of moving a certain tonnage of equipment over roads that were barely tracks and temperatures that destroyed machinery, the satisfaction of a manifest that balanced perfectly at the end of a complex operation, the absurdity of some of it. She asked specific follow-up questions. She remembered details from one conversation and referenced them in the next. That's not nothing. Most people don't do that. On day 10, she had a day off. She offered to show me somewhere tourists didn't usually go. We took her motorbike, me on the back, slightly rigid with the particular discomfort of a 54-year-old man who is not accustomed to being a passenger, through District 3 and on into District 10, which has none of the tourist infrastructure of District 1, and considerably more of what the city actually looks like when it's not performing for visitors. She showed me a covered market off a narrow hem where women sold live crabs and dried fish and plastic household goods and fabric by the meter, all of it under one low roof, the smell overwhelming in the best possible way. She explained things in Vietnamese as we walked and then translated selected portions for me, and the selection was, I noticed, generous. She chose the interesting details, the context, behind the things that actually helped me understand what I was looking at. She ate a banh mi standing at the side of the alley, pulling it apart as she walked. And she made fun of the way I was holding mine because apparently I had it at the wrong angle and was about to lose the filling. This is not a significant event in any objective sense, but I'm telling you about it because the texture of an afternoon matters, and the texture of that afternoon was easy, companionable, like two people who had decided independently that this was a reasonable way to spend a few hours. I extended my trip at the end of week 1, booked 10 more days. Vietnam was doing something to me that I couldn't have named precisely. A loosening, maybe, or just the relief of being occupied without obligation, and I'd have probably extended it regardless. Yet, but Lynn was part of the calculation. I knew she was. I noted it and kept going anyway. Now here's where I'm going to be honest with you about the money because the money is the story and I should tell it properly. I paid for everything. Every coffee, every meal we had together, every grab we took when the weather was too hot to walk. She never asked. I always offered. I told myself it was just manners. I was the one with the pension. I was the one who had the spending money. It would have been embarrassing to sit there and count out who owed what. And that was true as far as it went. I think some of it was also that paying felt like participation, like a way of being useful in a context where I had no other obvious function. I spent maybe €300 across the extended stay and shared costs, coffees, food, taxis, one meal at a proper restaurant in District 3 where the fish was excellent, and the bill came to 180,000 dong between us, roughly €6.50 each, which is the kind of figure that does something to your sense of proportion when you've spent 40 quid on a mediocre sandwich in Dublin Airport 2 weeks prior. There were things I noticed but didn't examine. I want to say that plainly. I wasn't oblivious. I just chose each time not to push. Her schedule was vague. She referred to shifts without ever being specific about which days or what hours. I assumed massage work was irregular, walk-in trade, bookings that changed, and this seemed reasonable. She had 2 phones. She mentioned this herself early on and unprompted, the way you mention something when you want it to be unremarkable. One was her work phone for bookings, one was her personal Zalo. I accepted this without a second thought. I'd spent 24 years in an organization where people routinely carried 2 phones. It's not unusual. I note it now because I catalog it now, the way you eventually go back and read a document you signed without fully reading. She introduced me once to her cousin Phuong, a warm, round-faced woman who spoke almost no English and laughed a lot anyway. We had bunthit nuong together at a plastic table on a pavement in Binh Thuan, the grilled pork sweet in the heat, and Phuong made a comment in Vietnamese that made Lynn say oi and look away smiling. It was a pleasant evening. I think about it sometimes. What I never had was any friend of Lynn's who wasn't family. No colleague her own age, no school friend. Nobody she'd grown up with or come to the city with. The social world she showed me was Phuong and Phuong's orbit and nothing else. I didn't ask about this. I think about that now. Should have asked, didn't. The thing she never did, and this was the thing my assessment kept returning to, was ask. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for gifts. She didn't introduce me to a world of need and obligation the way the stories online described, where the requests started small and escalated. None of that. She was self-sufficient in the way she presented herself, organized, going about her life in which I was, at most, a pleasant peripheral. And I want to be straight with you. That absence of asking, I treated it as evidence. I treated it as proof. She's not asking, therefore she doesn't want anything, therefore this is genuine. And I ran that logic in my head more than once, and each time it returned the result I wanted it to return. That's not assessment. That's just loneliness doing the maths. By the start of week 3, I was fond of her. Not love, no. I'm too old and too cautious for that word after 3 weeks. But something real. She made me feel for the first time in about 2 years like a person worth having a conversation with. I found myself wishing, privately and not usefully, that 23 years didn't sit between us. But they did. And I was a grown man. And I knew what I was. The ask when it came didn't feel like an ask. That was the engineering of it. Day 18. We'd spent the afternoon at a small cafe on Vo Van Tan, One of those places with tiled floors and ceiling fans that moves the hot air around without cooling it. Eat where they serve sauffet and fresh limeade and leave you alone with both for as long as you want. I was flying home in 3 days. We didn't talk about that directly. We talked about other things. And the fact of my departure sat underneath the conversation like a low note. Walking back to where she'd parked the motorbike, she started it, and it made a sound. A grinding, reluctant sound from somewhere in the engine that didn't belong there. She dismissed it immediately, and it's always done that, it's fine, don't worry. And I let it go because I know nothing about motorbikes and she does. We said goodbye on the street. She had a shift starting. I walked back toward Pham Ngu Lao. 2 hours later, the Zalo message came. She'd taken it to a mechanic on the way home. The engine needed significant work. The mechanic had written up the job and it came to 22 million Vietnamese dong. She was, she said, mortified to even mention it. She'd been trying to figure out how to cover it herself. She was sorry to tell me, she wasn't asking. I read that message in my guest house room with a bottle of Bia Saigon I'd bought from the place downstairs. And I did what I always do with a problem. I assessed it. The facts as I understood them. The bike had made a sound I'd heard with my own ears in real time, before anyone had any reason to manufacture it. She hadn't told me at the moment, she'd deflected, which is what a person with pride does, not what a person running a script does. The amount was 22 million dong. That's roughly 800 euro. And I'd spent more than that on a long weekend in Galway the previous spring for a wedding I hadn't particularly wanted to attend. She offered to repay it in installments. She didn't say when. She didn't propose a schedule. She just said she'd pay it back. I transferred the money. I told her not to worry about paying it back, and she sent a voice message. 30 seconds, her voice quieter than usual, saying thank you and that she hoped I had a safe flight home and that she was embarrassed. Now, I want to pause here and address what I know you're thinking because I thought it too in a part of my brain I was choosing not to fully consult. Was the bike actually broken? I didn't see an invoice. I couldn't have read one in Vietnamese if I had, and I have no way of knowing whether a mechanic had ever looked at that engine or whether the 22 million went somewhere else entirely. I chose not to know. I made an active decision to accept the story because the alternative, that I'd misread the situation this badly, this early, was something I wasn't ready to sit with yet. I'm telling you this so you understand. The rationalization wasn't passive. It was work. I put effort into it. The last 3 days before I flew home were different in texture, more honest feeling, less guarded. She told me she'd been glad when I came back to the shop that first time. Not in a romantic way, just she'd liked talking to me. I told her I hadn't expected to like Vietnam as much as I did. Neither of us made any declaration about what that meant. She didn't come to the airport on the Tuesday morning she had a shift, and I was relieved by this because airport goodbyes are a kind of claim, and neither of us had made that kind of claim yet, and I preferred it that way. Roscommon in December. The flat was exactly as I'd left it. The window looked out onto the same car park. The coffee maker was on the counter. There was a letter from the solicitor about a final administrative matter in the divorce proceedings, the language of which I did not read carefully enough to summarize for you now. I've sent a Sunday message. I noticed it more than usual. Lynn and I kept messaging. Daily, now, rather than the loose rhythm of before. Something had settled into a consistent pattern, the way a supply route does once it's been established, and the variables have been accounted for. I noticed, and without naming it to myself, that I was checking my phone at regular intervals, that I had a reason to check my phone. After 8 months of a phone that mostly showed me news I didn't want and messages from my solicitor, I'm going to be plain about it, this was something I'd needed without knowing I needed it. 3 weeks after I got home, the message arrived at 7 in the morning my time. She'd been up, she said, couldn't sleep. Her mother, who lived in A Tin province in central Vietnam, had been admitted to hospital the night before. Something cardiac, not critical, they thought, but she needed monitoring and medication, and the hospital required payment up front, as they do, before treatment could proceed. Her siblings were trying to gather what they could. She wasn't asking me for anything. She just needed to tell someone. I put the phone down. I made a cup of tea I didn't drink. I stood at the window looking at the car park for 45 minutes. I'm going to tell you exactly what went through my head, because this is the part of the story where the honest version matters most. I knew the shape of this. I'd read about it specifically in expat forums before I'd ever booked the flights. Emergency, female relative, remote province, hospital costs, foreigner with money. I knew this story. I could have drawn the architecture of it on a piece of paper. On the other side of the ledger, I could afford it. If it was real, if her mother was actually in a hospital in Hattin with a cardiac problem and the family was short, and I did nothing because I was worried about being taken for a fool, what kind of man does that make me? I'd spent 24 years in an organization built on the idea that you don't leave people without what they need when you have the means to provide it. That's not sentiment. That's how I'm built. And then, and this is the part 1,000 least comfortable saying out loud, I'd put enough of myself into this by now that I couldn't assess it the way I'd have assessed it 6 weeks earlier. The emotional account was too full. The financial decision had become entangled with something else, and I couldn't separate them cleanly anymore. I tried. I did the thing in my head where I laid out the inputs and the outputs and tried to read what the data was actually telling me. And I knew, somewhere below the level of that exercise, that I was doing a logistics assessment to avoid admitting that the logistics assessment had already failed. I transferred 22 million Vietnamese dong, about 800 euro. She thanked me and sent a photo of her mother's name on a hospital admission board. I didn't ask to speak to her. I'm not sure why. It just didn't occur to me. 2 weeks later, follow-up treatment. Another 8 million, roughly 300 euro. I transferred that too. And then I booked the flights back to Ho Chi Minh City. I told myself I wanted to see how she was getting on. I told myself Vietnam had been good for me and I might as well go back. I told myself a lot of things. Standing in the Roscommon flat in January, clicking through the Aer Lingus website with a cup of tea going cold on the counter. I'm not sure if I was going back to check on her or because the flat had started feeling smaller since I'd come home. Probably both. Probably both things at once, and I didn't ask myself to decide which. This time I rented an apartment. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Not a guest house, an apartment. Short stay, fully furnished, a third-floor place on a narrow street in District 3 with a small balcony that looked out onto the power lines and the rooftops, and, on clear evenings, a strip of orange sky to the west. It cost 14 million Vietnamese dong a month, about 500 euro, which was considerably cheaper per night than the guest house had been, and I told myself that was the reason. Economical, practical, the kind of decision a sensible man makes. It also meant I had a kitchen, a washing machine, a key on a fob that I carried in my pocket. It meant I was not a tourist passing through, and I knew that, and I did it anyway. The relationship had a different quality now. More routine, less tentative. She came over some evenings after her shift ended. The work phone and the personal Zalo still distinct, the schedule still vague, none of that had changed. And she'd find me attempting to cook something from a market I'd walked to that morning. I say attempting because my cooking is, in her words, ambitious but misinformed. She told me once I'd bought the wrong type of rice for what I was trying to make. I didn't know there were types. She found this funnier than I felt it deserved. She sat on the kitchen counter while I salvaged what I could of the dinner and talked about her day. And it resembled, uncomfortably and pleasantly simultaneously, a version of domesticity I'd thought I was done with. I let myself feel it without fully examining what I was feeling. That was, I think, a choice. Her mother was recovering. Photos came through from Hattin, an older woman in a hospital bed, then sitting up, then at home, in what looked like a small house with a tiled floor and a family altar in the corner. She looked tired, but okay. Lynn said the doctors were happy with the progress. I said I was glad. I didn't ask to speak to her mother. It didn't occur to me to ask. I think about that now, Inks. How easy it would have been to say, put her on. I'd like to say hello. I didn't. I don't know if it would have changed anything. But I didn't. About 2 weeks into that return visit, she mentioned the salon. Not as a proposal, as a hypothetical. Almost as a daydream she was slightly embarrassed to be having out loud. A cousin of hers, she said. Phuong's sister, actually, not Phuong herself. This cousin did nails, was good at it, had built up a following at her current job. There was a small commercial space that had come available in District 7. She'd walked past it. She'd looked in the window. She knew it was probably nothing. She knew it was probably a dream. I asked her to tell me more. That was the moment. I know it was the moment because I've thought about it enough times since that it's worn smooth in my memory, like a stone you keep handling. She wasn't pushing. She wasn't selling. I leaned in. That was me. I made that choice. And I want to be clear about that because it matters to how I understand what happened. She showed me the spreadsheet on her phone. I'll be honest with you, it was a good spreadsheet. Whoever put it together knew what they were doing. Rental costs for the District 7 space, 8 million Vietnamese dong per month, roughly €300, which I cross-checked against listings I found online that evening and found to be accurate to within 10%. Equipment list, manicure stations, UV lamps, ventilation, signage, itemized with supplier names and prices. Projected revenue based on the cousin's current client numbers. Extrapolated to a new space with higher capacity. An 18-month break-even estimate. Columns that summed correctly. Assumptions that were stated rather than hidden. I reviewed it the way I'd review a logistics document. I asked questions. She had answers. Not immediately, not glibly, but she'd message me the following day with figures she'd looked up, or a clarification from the cousin. It was coherent. The numbers held together. It looked like a real business plan put together by someone who'd done their homework. I sat with it for 4 days. During those 4 days, I Googled the District 7 rental market and confirmed the figures. I messaged Siran and Da Nang, obliquely, not wanting to explain the whole situation, and asked whether he'd ever put money into anything local. He said, be careful with that, and didn't elaborate. I filed this under Siran being cautious, Kiran not knowing Lin, Siran not having the full picture. He said, be careful. I heard he doesn't know what I know. I also walked to the space in District 7 one afternoon. It was real. It existed. An empty shop front on a commercial street near the Korean restaurant cluster, a for lease sign in the window, the right dimensions for what the spreadsheet described. It was a real location. That felt significant. I don't know now why I thought a real location was the confirmation I needed, as if someone constructing a fiction would forget to pick an actual address. We discussed terms. He'd be a silent investor. No formal arrangement because, as a foreigner, I couldn't be named in a Vietnamese business registration anyway, so any agreement would be unenforceable. And he'd be repaid from profits over a 3-year period. I knew when we were discussing this that it was unenforceable. I said it out loud, essentially. There's no legal way to structure this. She said she knew. She said she wasn't asking me to trust a contract. She was asking me to trust her. I transferred 120 million Vietnamese dong, approximately €4,000. I did it through a transfer service she recommended, which was legitimate. And I noted with some detached amusement that the transfer fees alone cost more than the entire first month of shared expenses I'd spent on coffees and taxis back in November. After that, the texture shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way I could point to and say, that's when it changed. She was warmer with me than before, but slightly elsewhere. Messages came later in the day or sometimes the next morning with an apology. Busy, sorry, things to sort out with the space. When we were together, she was warm, present enough, but there was a distraction underneath it that I attributed to the excitement and stress of a new project. I've known people starting businesses. They go a bit somewhere else for a while. I told myself this was that. I asked once to go and see how the fit-out was progressing, just wanted to see the space taking shape. She said it wasn't ready, there was nothing to see yet, she'd tell me when it was worth the trip. That was reasonable. Construction is ugly before it's finished. Photos arrived on Zalo of her and Phuong's sister at a location that was plausibly the space. Walls, a window, some boxes. Nothing that actually showed work being done. I noticed this without quite noticing it. I asked whether the lease had been signed. She said soon. The second installment, 67 million Vietnamese dong, the roughly €2,500 we'd agreed, was scheduled. On a Wednesday evening, I opened the transfer app and put the details in and got as far as the confirmation screen. I paused it. I told myself I was just waiting for the bank's overnight confirmation. That was true, technically. There was a processing window, but there was something else happening underneath that. Something I couldn't quite name and wasn't sure I wanted to. Something that had been sitting quietly in the back of my neck for a week. I closed the app. I made a cup of tea. I sat on the balcony for a while with the District 3 rooftops in front of me, and the sound of a karaoke bar 2 streets over leaking into the warm night air, someone singing a Vietnamese pop song with great confidence and limited accuracy. Then I opened Facebook. I want to list the things I knew because listing things is how I think. The salon I'd invested in that I hadn't been allowed to visit. The schedule that had never once resolved into a specific day or a specific hour. The two phones introduced unprompted, the way you introduce something you want to become unremarkable. The friends her own age who didn't exist. Only Fuang, only family, only the orbit she'd constructed and shown me. The lease that was always soon. The photos that showed a location but never showed work. None of these things individually was conclusive. I knew that. I'd told myself that. But I'd been a logistics man for 24 years, and I knew what it meant when a manifest kept having small discrepancies that all resolved in one direction. You note the first one. You note the second. By the time you're noting the sixth, you already know what you're dealing with. You're just deciding when to say it out loud. I found her Facebook without difficulty. She'd given me her Zalo name months ago, and her surname was visible there. I searched it, and her Facebook came up semi-public. Photos of food, mostly. A few pictures with Fuang. A family gathering at what looked like Tet, red envelopes, incense on a family altar. An older woman I assumed was her mother looking healthy enough. Nothing that told me anything I didn't know. I sat with it. And then, in the column on the right side of the screen, the people you may know section, which operates on its own logic regardless of what you want. And I saw a Zalo community group for a neighborhood near the Massage district, a local residents group, announcements, photos of street events. She was in the member list. I want to be honest about what happened next. I wasn't in a rage. I wasn't even particularly certain of anything yet. I was operating on something below the level of certainty, something I can only describe as the particular alertness that arrives when a situation has finally earned your full attention. I created the profile methodically. This is what I do. This is what 24 years of making things work taught me. You identify what the situation requires. You gather the materials. You construct the thing with care. I found a stock photo on a free image site. A middle-aged American man, pleasant and nondescript, the kind of face that appears in insurance advertisements. I made him a Facebook account. I gave him 3 posts, a beach in Thailand 2 months ago, a comment about Hanoi traffic, a photo of Paho with a caption about finally understanding what all the fuss was about. I spaced them out. I joined 2 Facebook groups for foreign travelers in Ho Chi Minh City. I made him look like someone who'd been moving through Southeast Asia, who'd heard about a massage place from someone at a hostel who was sending a cold message to a stranger. It took about 40 minutes. I found this technically satisfying in the way that any well-executed piece of logistics is satisfying. I noted, somewhere below that I was not finding it funny. I sent the message. Hi, I am an HCMC for business. Someone recommended you for massage. Do you know a good place? Clumsy English, friendly tone. I put the phone face down on the kitchen counter and watched an hour of Vietnamese television I didn't understand. Which is what I'd been doing most evenings lately anyway. When I checked the phone, she had replied. She was warm, she was welcoming. She recommended the shop by name, said she worked there, said she could arrange a good rate for him. For the American in the photo, for the man who did not exist. And then, without being asked, without any prompt or invitation, she included her Zalo contact. Said to message her directly, she'd make sure he was looked after. I read it 3 times. Then I put the phone face down on the table and I left it there. I made tea. I filled the kettle and switched it on and stood in the kitchen while it boiled. And then I poured it over a tea bag and forgot to take the tea bag out and forgot to drink the tea. I moved to the balcony. The karaoke place 2 streets over was still going. A different song now, slower. Something I almost recognized. The tangled power lines above the street below me, the scooters still threading past at 11 at night. Someone's incense from a ground floor altar carrying up to where I was standing. I worked through it the way I work through any logistics problem. Inputs, outputs, what the data actually says, what the data said. She was actively recruiting. The message she'd sent the American was indistinguishable in tone and structure from her first messages to me. She had a pattern. She was working it. Whether she had genuine feelings for me somewhere inside that pattern, whether any of it had been real in some partial way, the conversations about the Army, the Roscommon questions, the afternoon in District 10, I couldn't determine, and it didn't change the output. The salon might exist. The space in District 7 was a real address. The mother might have been genuinely unwell. That detail had been too specific and too verifiable to have been invented entirely. The motorbike had made a sound I'd heard with my own ears, but the architecture around all of it, the patience, the sequence, the careful absence of asking followed by the perfectly timed emergence of need, that was a system, and I'd been put through it. At 11:47 p.m., I canceled the second installment transfer, the 67 million Vietnamese dong, the roughly €2,500, and did not leave my account. I sent Lynn one message on Zalo, I think we both know. Then I sat with my phone in my hand and waited. She didn't reply for 3 hours. I didn't sleep. The city made its usual sounds beneath the balcony, and I sat in the dark, with the tea I hadn't drunk going completely cold on the table beside me. At 2:15 in the morning, the message came. It was long, it was detailed. It was punctuated with ellipses that read like pauses for breath, like someone composing through tears. She explained everything. The Zalo contact she'd given the stranger was a referral service she offered for tourists. She did this for the shop. It was part of her job. It was not what I was thinking. She had feelings for me that were real, that she hadn't planned, that had complicated something she'd started with different intentions, and she was sorry for that. She wasn't a bad person. She hoped I understood. It was a good message. I read it carefully, the way I read any document that might contain information. What it didn't contain was a single question. No, what happened? No, what do you mean? No, I don't understand what you're saying. She knew exactly what I'd done. She knew because she'd recognized the profile, or because she'd received enough messages that she recognized the pattern of a test, or because someone had told her. Any of those possibilities told me what I needed to know. I didn't reply. I put the phone down on the table next to the cold tea, and I sat there in the dark for a while longer, listening to the city. And then I went inside and lay on the bed without sleeping and waited for the morning to come. In the morning, I did the accounting. This is what I do when I need to think clearly. I make a list, I put numbers next to things, I look at what the columns actually say. I sat at the small table in the District 3 apartment with a coffee I'd made myself badly, and I went through it. The motorbike, 22 million Vietnamese dong, about €800, her mother's hospital costs, first admission and follow-up, 30 million Vietnamese dong in total, roughly €1,100. My return flights and the apartment rental for this visit, another €1,100 approximately when you added it all together. The first salon installment, 120 million Vietnamese dong, €4,000. The accumulated shared expenses across the whole thing, coffees, meals, taxis, the restaurant in District 3 with the good fish, roughly 8 to 9 million Vietnamese dong. Call it €300. Total, approximately €5,800. Gone. Saved by pausing the transfer at 11:47 p.m., 67 million VND, €2,500, still in my account. Remaining savings somewhere around €74,200. Not ruined, just educated. That's the phrase I keep using when I run the numbers, which I've done more times than I should probably admit. Not ruined, just educated. Lynn sent 2 more messages over the following week. I didn't respond to either of them. I want to be clear about why. It wasn't anger exactly, and it wasn't the kind of cold satisfaction you might expect from a man who'd caught something out. I just had nothing to say. The assessment was complete. The outcome was known. There was no version of a conversation that would add information I needed. I called Siran in Da Nang on the Thursday, told him what had happened, not all of it, the broad shape of it. He listened. He said, "That's rough, Deck." He didn't say, "I told you." I appreciated that more than I can explain to you. Some people would have said, "I told you." Kieran didn't. That's the measure of a person, I think. Not what they do when things go right, but what they refrain from doing when things go wrong. I considered going home. Spent a few days considering it. The flat in Roscommon would still be there. The car park window, the coffee maker on the counter, Aoife's Sunday messages. I could go back and live the life I'd been living before I came here, minus €5,800 in a few months. I decided against it. I'm still not entirely sure why. Stubbornness, probably. Some residual sense that I hadn't finished something, though I'd have struggled to name what. Maybe just that the flat in Roscommon was waiting for me in exactly the same way it always had been. And Vietnam, for all the mess of the last few months, still felt like somewhere I was choosing rather than somewhere I'd ended up. I spent the last week of the District 3 lease walking, more than before and without any particular destination. I ate alone. Pho in the mornings at a place on a side street that opened at 6 and was full of people in work clothes by half 6. Calm tam in the evenings at a place where the owner had started recognizing me and would bring the food without me ordering. I started trying, properly, to learn some Vietnamese. Not from an app, from listening. From asking the coffee woman on the alley what things were called. She found my pronunciation entertaining but was patient about it. I moved to District 7. Smaller apartment, quieter street, about 12 million VND a month, €450, which is less than the District 3 place and more honest about what I actually need. There's a coffee place on the corner that I go to every morning. The owner is a man roughly my age who nods when I sit down, that's all. He doesn't speak English. I don't speak enough Vietnamese. We nod, he brings the coffee. I sit with it. It asks nothing of me and I ask nothing of it, and this has turned out to be a more comfortable way to start a day than I'd have predicted. I talk to Awafa on WhatsApp on Sundays now. Not about any of this, she doesn't need to know the details of her father's expensive education, but about ordinary things. Her course, which is nursing, second year. My food. The traffic, which she finds amusing. A few weeks ago I said something, I can't remember what, and she laughed. A real laugh, not a polite one. I noted this without making too much of it. That was a good Sunday. Now, you want to know what I actually think about Lynn? I know you do, because it's the question the whole thing keeps circling back to, and I've been circling it myself. Here's what I've decided, for what it's worth. I don't know, and I've stopped trying to know. I think the conversations were real, or real enough. The curiosity about Roscommon, the way she listened, the wire argument, the afternoon in the market. I think a person can have a system and still have real moments within it. I think those two things can both be true at the same time. And I think the part of me that wanted one of them to cancel out the other was the part of me that wasn't thinking clearly. She had a pattern. She was working it. She also, possibly in some portion that I'll never be able to measure, found me genuinely interesting to talk to. I can't unknot which was which. I've decided it cost me too much to keep trying. What I can tell you is this. I was lonely. Not in a way I'd have said out loud or admitted to readily. I'm not that kind of man, or I thought I wasn't. But deeply and practically lonely in the way you can be when the structure that shaped every day of your adult life disappears and you don't know what to put in its place. I dressed that loneliness up in the language of professional caution. I called it assessment. I called it keeping my eyes open. I called it being a careful man who couldn't be taken for a fool. And it was still loneliness, and it still did the navigation. And I still ended up €5,800 lighter for the experience. The ask that never comes is not evidence of honesty. Patience is also a strategy. If you find yourself running a threat assessment to prove to yourself that you're not in danger, you're probably already in danger. And your loneliness traveled with you. Whatever you came out here to escape, it came too. Sort that out first, or it'll do the navigating. I'm not a clever man. I knew that going in. But I still thought I was clever enough. That's the bit that'll get you. That's Declan Murda, still in District 7, still having coffee every morning, getting slowly a bit better at the Vietnamese. There's a version of you watching this who recognized something in what he said. Not the Vietnam part, maybe. Not the massage shop or the Zalo messages or the spreadsheet. But the other part. The part about what loneliness looks like when it's wearing the clothes of a sensible decision. If that's you, and I say this as gently as I can, the money was never really the point, was it? What makes Declan's story unusual among the stories we tell here at Inside Vietnam is not that he was smarter. He wasn't smarter. He made every mistake in sequence with full awareness of each one as he made it, and made them anyway. What's unusual is that he paused. At 11:47 on a Wednesday night in District 3, something in him, the logistics habit, the army discipline, some residual instinct for checking the manifest, made him hesitate long enough to look. Most of the men in these stories don't pause. By the time they're suspicious, the money is gone and there's nothing left to do except count it. The massage industry in Ho Chi Minh City is vast, professional, and almost entirely legitimate. Most of the people working in it are doing exactly what they say they're doing, with skill and without any secondary agenda. The corridors where something else is happening are real but specific, and they're navigable with basic awareness and honest self-knowledge. Inside Vietnam is not here to tell you that Vietnam is dangerous. It's here to tell you that you are. We're grateful to Declan for telling this story. It takes a particular kind of courage to sit down and describe the exact mechanism of your own foolishness, in order with specific figures. He did that. Whatever it cost him, and it cost him something, he wanted it to be worth something for somebody else. We hope it is. Until next time, take care of yourselves out there and take care of each other. This is Inside Vietnam.